and welcome to MAPS Administrator Training. My name is Barb and I'll be leading the training today. I would first like to go over the collaboration and support, which are resources for our products. The 4 different resources are Co-op User Community, In-Product Help, Knowledge Base, and Evisions Help Desk. The Co-op community is located on the Evisions website under the Support tab. It's where Evisions clients can collaborate by sharing Argos data blocks, Form Fusion templates, and posting forums. The in-product help provides specific information about a feature in each of our products. For example, if you're not sure what a button does. While viewing the button on your screen, press the F1 key on your keyboard. It will automatically launch your default web browser and direct you to the in-product help page. I'll show you an example of using the in-product help during the training. The knowledge base contains most frequently asked questions and includes information about common issues for all MAPS applications. You can also submit a help desk ticket to contact an Evisions support tech for further assistance or to ask any questions you have. You can submit a help desk ticket at helpdesk.evisions.com or at the link in the slide. Now I'll show you where the knowledge base is located. First, go to the Evisions website. Click on the Support tab, and it will take you to the New Web Browser tab to the Support site. In the Support site, click on the Knowledge Base link. Here is the Knowledge Base homepage. You may locate the Knowledge Base article under the specific application. Here's Argos, and here's MAPS. And you can also search for errors or keywords. For example, if I want to find information about how to obtain an SSL certificate, I would simply type SSL certificate into the search box. The search will return every article that relates to SSL certificates. The goal of today's training is to familiarize MAPS administrators with the MAPS configuration tool. Here are the objectives. We will be discussing what MAPS is and what it does, what the configuration requirements are for MAPS, the minimum application configuration that is required for all applications. We will also discuss additional application-specific settings. We'll then cover the universal settings, and finally we'll be reviewing the Argos-specific features. MAPS stands for Multiple Application Platform Server. MAPS is web-enabled and is used as the central access, configuration, and delivery point for all the Evisions applications. MAPS can run on any Windows Server operating system listed here. MAPS requires at least a dual-core 3.0 GHz processor with 4 GB of RAM. Please be sure to have at least 100 GB of disk space. Please make sure you have the correct OLEDB providers for your data source. For example, when connecting to an Oracle database, you want to use the Oracle OLEDB provider, not the Microsoft provider for Oracle. Also, if you are going to install MAPS on a 64-bit operating system, you must install a 32-bit OLEDB provider. Anytime you're configuring MAPS, you must be on the MAPS server or logged in via remote desktop, especially when you are performing an initial configuration, creating an ADO connection, adding a printer, or performing software upgrades. We're going to go over what you need to do to get MAPS up and running as quickly as possible. We'll go over how to perform an initial configuration and install the license. We'll then install applications and learn what configuration options are required to get an application up and running. The first thing we need to do is download the MAPS installer. It's available on the Evisions documentation and software webpage. So first we go back to the Evisions website page. In the Enter Additional Search text box, search for Maps Setup. And then click the Search Now button. The map software shows up in the list, and you can click the Download button to download. Once the software is downloaded, run the setup to install Maps. I'm not going to run through an actual installation, but you can review the documentation on the support website or submit a help desk ticket if you have any questions. There is a Maps Installation Quick Start Guide available. Search for Maps Quick Install and select Installation as the document type. The first one listed here is the Maps Installation Quick Start Guide. Click on the Download button to download the PDF. When the Maps install completes, go to the eLauncher webpage. The URL address for the eLauncher page is http localhost 8080, and you must be on the Map server. This web page is known as the eLauncher page. The Maps eLauncher page defaults to port 8080, but you can change the port inside Maps. Normally, I would work from localhost, but since this is a training session, I will be using our internal Map server. This login screen only occurs when accessing the eLauncher page through HTTPS. For security purposes, I will need to log in through HTTPS. Over the Maps Config tab, click on the Maps Power button to launch the Maps Configuration tool. The default login username is administrator with a default password of password with an uppercase P. I would recommend that you change the password for the administrator account and create another user with administrative privileges as a backup. For this training, I will be logging in as an administrator trainer instead of administrator. On the initial login, you will get a message saying that the Map server is currently in demonstration mode. That's because the Maps license has not yet been applied. Click through that message and it will take you to the Maps configuration tool. The first step is loading your Maps license, and to do that, click on the License tab on the left pane. Then click on the Read from File to load your license. I'm not going to reload our license, but you can see that the license file has the extension .mapslicense. When you found your license, click Open. However, if you cannot find your Maps license file, please submit a help desk ticket for assistance. When you load your license the first time, a dialog box will pop up and ask if you want to install the other applications. Click Yes to install the other applications until all your applications are installed. Please note that the Read from Web button is an option to apply the updated license directly from the Evisions website. After you have installed all your applications, click the Check for Updates button on the bottom left corner to make sure that all the applications are up to date. If there are any updates, keep clicking the Check for Updates button until there are no more updates. Please note that Evisions does recommend updating on a test server to ensure everything is working fine before applying the updates on production. After installing our applications, we will need to configure them. There are 3 settings that are required for all applications: users who can access the applications, an ADO connection to the data source, and a local or network printer for the applications to use. If you do not plan on printing, a printer is still required to set up scheduling within Argos and generating any output for Form Fusion. There are 2 types of users within MAPS. You can create MAPS users or add LDAP users. MAPS users are internal users and they are administered in the MAPS configuration tool. LDAP users are created from the LDAP server, but you can add them in the MAPS configuration tool. ADO stands for ActiveX Data Objects. It opens the connection and allows you to access and manipulate the database. I'll provide more information about the ADO connection settings when we get to set one up. Argos has 4 custom roles: Report Viewer, Report Writer, Data Block Designer, and Argos Administrator. You can view these roles in the MAPS configuration tool. To do so, go to the MAPS configuration tool and go to User Roles under Users. On the left column, you can see the Argos roles with the bolded font. There's also a MAPS Administrator role that administers the entire MAPS server. On the right column, you will see Added Operations and Available Operations. The added operations are permissions that the user role has, whereas the available operations shows a list of possible permissions that a user role can have. Although you cannot modify the predefined user roles, you can instead copy the user role and add or remove any operation. For example, let's say you want to allow report writers to configure scheduling. You would first select Report Writer and click on Copy and then Paste. On the right side under Available Operations, add all of the scheduling operations to the Added Operations. And then we'll rename this Report Writer with Scheduling. So now anyone that's part of this modified report writer has the writer's operations and schedule operations. Now remember that we can handle 2 types of users, an LDAP user and a MAPS user. We'll start by discussing LDAP users. Under LDAP we have 2 options: Resource Users and Servers. The Resource Users page will show a list of LDAP users that were authenticated through LDAP groups. The Server page is where you would add your LDAP server. To add an LDAP server, click on the Add Server button. On this first section, we have the general server information. I'll go ahead and give the server a name. To the right is the Enabled checkbox, which allows the MAPS admin to disable or enable MAPS access to the LDAP server. Next, put the IP address or DNS name of the LDAP server under the LDAP host. The port number can also be changed if necessary. You can select a security or encryption and select SSL or TLS if necessary. And you can also enter a configuration account that can access the LDAP information. Under the users and groups, there are 4 available fields: user logon prefix, user logon postfix, user search base DN, and group search base DN. Include a user logon prefix and user logon postfix only if it's required for your LDAP server. The user search base DN is the node or object where user definitions are stored. If you leave the user search base blank, it will start from the node root. If all your users are in a specific node, you may want to specify a base DN for quicker results. The group search base DN is used in a similar manner, where you specify a node or object that contains the group definition. You can either type in a DN or use the ellipses to search for the DN. If you cannot browse the LDAP, then you may have a security issue that will require the assistance of your LDAP administrator. Name section is set with defaults, but if your LDAP server is configured differently, go ahead and make any changes here that you need. Now that we've defined your LDAP server, we can pull our users or groups directly from the server. Next, we're going to discuss groups. Groups are used to group users together. For example, you can create a group called Form Fusion and only add users that use Form Fusion. The Everyone group is created automatically and cannot be modified. So now let's go ahead and click Add to add a new group. The General section is where you can give the group a name and a description. So the Source section allows us to select Maps or LDAP. When we select LDAP, notice that the options change. You can click the Server drop-down to select the LDAP server. Afterwards, we need to add the distinguished name either by typing it in or browsing it by clicking on the Browse button. The Users section is where we add users to the group. With an LDAP group, the LDAP members will not show up in the listing, but you can assign additional members to the group. Any changes made here will not modify the LDAP server because changes only apply to maps. The User Roles section is where we can define the user roles for this group. Notice that we can add the predefined user roles or our custom roles. Both Maps and LDAP users are listed in the Users section. Here we can see all users that have been added to the Maps server. Note that Maps users are identified by a blue weeble, and LDAP users are identified by a blue weeble with a globe behind it. At the top of the page is where we go to add users. We can add a Maps user, an LDAP user, or import users from a CSV file. If you want to import users from a CSV file, the instructions are on the import screen. Here in the General section, you give the user a username and a description. And you can also assign a date for first and final use. The Source section gives us the option to choose Maps or LDAP. For Maps, you must give it a password. Under LDAP, you must select the LDAP server and browse for an LDAP user. The Advanced section allows us to set the queue priority and assigns the user an email address. If the user is LDAP, then it would use the user's email defined from the LDAP server. However, if an email address is included here for an LDAP user, then it will use the email that is defined here. If you are authenticating users through CAS, enter the CAS identifier for the user. This associates the MAPS username with the CAS identifier and allows the user to log in with their CAS credentials. The group section is where a user can be added directly to any created groups. You can add notes here about the user, and the user roles can be assigned here. Under the password policy, you can enforce how passwords are created for all MAPS users. Now that I have users and groups, let's create our first ADO connection. When adding a new ADO connection, you must be either on the MAP server or remoted onto the MAP server. Please do not modify the ADO connection from your local machine. The logo with the green and blue phones are connection pools. Pools allow you to group your connections. You can use connection pools like you would use a folder. I'm going to create a connection pool for our training session. Now let's create a new ADO connection under the connection pool. The edit window pops up and we are on the General tab. I'll go ahead and give the connection a name. And we want to make sure the name is something that makes sense to your users. Once we've named our connection, we need to create the connection string. To build the connection string, click on the ellipses button. This window shows you why you must be working locally on the MAP server, because this list of providers are pulled from the local. Assuming that we are going to connect to an Oracle database, I'll choose the Oracle OLEDB provider. Then you click Next or select the Connection tab. In the Connection section, type in the data source and the Oracle credentials. Placing a check in the Allow Saving Password option will save the entered password here. You can click on the Test Connection button to test the connection. Generally speaking, you won't need to use the Advanced section, and the All section has your properties settings. Now our ADO connection string has been created, and you can also edit the list of values in the property and value columns if necessary. This section shows you how you would define the connection's cursor behavior. You should only change them after consulting with Evisions. However, if you're curious about these properties, press the F1 key on your keyboard to view the in-product help for additional information. As you can see, there is additional information about the query properties in the in-product help. For the SQL formatting, I'll choose Oracle since we're connecting to an Oracle database. And at the bottom of the screen, we have Miscellaneous. The miscellaneous area is where we define how to handle comments and variables. By default, the Remove Line Comments is checked. This will strip off the line comment syntax from a SQL script, and the Remove Block Comments option will strip off the block comment syntax. The last option, Perform Variable Inline Substitutions, is something you will need to be careful with because it can affect existing Argos data blocks. I don't want to get into too much detail about the inline substitution, but in short, it affects data types from SQL queries, so I'd advise not to change this setting during production. The user group rules is where you can assign users or groups to the connection and configure how they will connect to the database. Each user or group can have its own rules, and each rule can authenticate against the database using a different username and password. To add groups and users to the connection, click on the person or group icon at the bottom, and then choose a group, and I'll go ahead and add the report writers. Now, once a user or group is added, you can specify the connection rules. There are 4 different ways to define how a user connects to the database. The first option is Not Allowed to Connect, which denies the user or group access to the database. Use Connection Username and Password means that it will use the credentials from the ADO connection string only if the credentials are there. Use the MAPS username and password means that the MAPS username and password will be used to connect to the data source. In other words, the MAPS username and password must be the same as the Oracle username and password, and essentially each MAPS user should have their own Oracle login. Use the following username and password means that the users will connect to the database with the username and password that is specified below. This means that the user or group will always use these credentials when connecting to the database. Once again, once you've given each user or group a connection login to the data source, you can further define the connection security using these checkboxes at the bottom. You can allow the user to use insert, update, and delete statements in their SQL or even run non-DML scripts. Just like the connection rules, these are specific to the groups and individuals listed. If the user is running these types of SQL statements, they will need permission on the database to do these things as well. They'll also need permissions on this end of the ADO connection. Below the SQL permission checkboxes is a rule script button. Here is where you can specify a script to run after the user or group logs into the database. Queuing rules allows you to restrict the number of queries running at a time. Down at the bottom is the Scripts tab, where while you can set up scripts at the user and group level, you can also set up a script at the connection level. Any script typed in here will run for all users of the connection. Scripts entered on the user group rules will only run for that user or group. Now that we have an ADO connection, we need to allow the product authorized use for the ADO connection. In the top right corner, you'll see Authorized for Use With. You need to give a product authorization to use this ADO connection. Click on the MAPS logo or right-click on Application to add a product. So we'll go ahead and authorize Argos, and you see Argos appears over here. Last but not least, we will need to add a printer. Please note that you must install the printer on the MAPS server before adding it into the MAPS configuration tool. To add a printer, go to Printer, and then click the Add Printer button. Then select the printer that you want to add, and click OK. You can modify the name of the printer if you would like, and click OK when you're done. It's okay to change the friendly name of the printer, but you do not want to change the system name of the printer. Once the printer is installed, you'll also need to give authorized use for products and users or groups. This is in the same way that we gave authorized use for the ADO connection. Next, we're going to discuss the application-specific options that give users more flexibility in Maps. This includes email and file operations. So let's go over the email. To add in an email server, go to the Email section and Servers. Click on Add Server. And once in the Property window, give the server a name. Fill in the IP address or the DNS name. And you can select a security level or just leave it on auto detect. And then add the username and password. You also need to give authorization to a product to use the email server. Once you've entered the email server information, you can test the email server by clicking the Test button. In the Test Email dialog, put an email address in the To and From field and type anything in the subject body. I'm going to send a test email just to show how it will appear in the email queue. The email queue shows all of the unsent emails, and as you can see, we have the email earlier placed in the queue. An email may be placed on hold after MAPS attempts to send the email 4 times. The hold normally indicates that an error occurred for that email. To see what error occurred, you can double click on it to see what the error message is. So here you can see if it's on hold. Here's where any kind of error would be. Now, if you're unsure what to do about a particular error message, please submit a help desk ticket. And once the email is working properly, you can go ahead and give authorized use for the email server the same way you did with the printers. The next configuration option we have is File Operations. Under Server, File Operations. File Operations allows for directories to be accessible for the MAPS applications, which allows them to get or put files in that directory. Administrators can add a new directory path, either a local drive or a network path, by clicking on the green plus sign at the top. Type in your path here, or you can browse to your path. And once the path is added, configure the access modes in the bottom left corner and click OK to save your changes. Next, we'll cover the remaining MAPS options that are universal. These settings will cover MAPS and the applications across the board. I'll show you auditing and data warehouse, CAS, inspector, logging, maplets, and the server options, which are backups, diagnostics, HTTP file server, IP restrictions, launch page, messages, and the universal launcher. First, we have auditing. In auditing, maps can store and log specific types of information in the data store. In configuration, we can set various options such as number of days to keep and archiving options. The data warehouse is a new feature for Maps 4.3. This allows you to query Maps and Argos information without querying the actual Maps and Argos SQLite databases. Under Detail, we see all the actions that have been recorded. And the summary provides a daily summary of activities grouped by object type. The CAS server section allows you to configure maps to use a CAS server. To add your CAS server, click on Add Server. Then enter a name of your CAS server and the URL address. The Inspector section allows you to see who is currently logged into different products. You can see a list of all the current connections. On the bottom, you can also send a broadcast message to all of the connected clients. You can also select a client and drop them. You can view specific details from the buttons on the right or send them an individual message on the bottom. The logging configuration section is where you configure what you want to log. You can build your logging string by selecting what you want to log. The log section allows you to see all the logs and view them. You can open the log file by double-clicking on it. Maplets are server-side applications for each of the Evisions Maps applications. Having the maplets separate allows you to manage them individually without affecting Maps or the other applications. This shows what versions of the maplets you're currently running. And here we have the server section. The server section is where you can configure the options for the map server. At the top there's a link for release notes, and you can see what version of maps you're running. The Update Service button allows you to manually update the Maps application, though we recommend you use the Check for Updates button at the bottom. The Cancel Pending Update button will cancel updates that haven't started yet. As a caution, this should only be done under advisement from an Evisions tech. The Restart and Stop the service buttons control the map service. Please note that you will not regain control back at the configuration tool. You will need to go to the Microsoft Services applet to start the service manually. Maps can automatically check for updates for any installed applications. Only the admin will be notified of updates available. The backup section allows you to configure when and how often to run backups. There are two types of backups. Functional backups are created by the server when it's updated, and automated backups are created by the server at a specified time. The diagnostic section shows you the current information about the server, such as memory use, free space, uptime, number of concurrent users, and application-specific data. Here is the HTTP file server information. You can stop and start the web server and change the default port. If you want to create an HTTPS server, you would configure that here. Under Advanced Settings are configuration for Content Delivery Network, SSL versions, and OpenSSL ciphers. The Content Delivery Network, or CDN, URL field contains the location where Maps looks for the CDN. Evisions uses a CDN to deploy updates to the product launch page and Argos Web Viewer without requiring you to update the map service or the Argos Maplet. The default URL points to the hosted content on Evisions servers located at that link. Altering this URL will cause Maps to look in a different location for the eLauncher and WebViewer files and should only be done when working with an Evisions tech on a support issue. You can enable SSL versions as well as set OpenSSL cipher list here. The IP restrictions page allows or denies access to maps. The Launch Page section allows you to change the look of the eLauncher page by specifying custom colors and logos. The Messages section allows you to set a message that displays to all users who are logged on. The Universal Launcher controls the default system name and IP address that is passed to the client. As Google Chrome disabled NP API support in September of 2015, it is no longer possible to use Java to launch maps and the associated applications using Chrome. In order to better support our users who prefer the Chrome browser, Evisions added the option to launch without Java using the Evisions application launcher in Maps version 4.5. When the Evisions application launcher is specified for the Select Launcher option, all end users will be prompted to download and install the Evisions application launcher when they try to launch an application from the eLauncher page. For more information on this feature, please refer to the Maps 4.5 release guide, or you can open a help desk ticket if you have any questions. Other supported web browsers such as Firefox and Internet Explorer can still utilize Java to launch Maps applications from the eLauncher page. The next few features of Maps I'm going to go over are Argos specific, such as scheduling, FTP, data dictionary, and API HTTP refer. I'm not going to be going over them with too much detail, but if you have any questions about them, please submit a help desk ticket. The configuration area contains additional options for the scheduler. You can activate or deactivate the schedules here. And you can also set the maximum number of concurrent threads and change the default timeout. In version 5.0, you can also designate a system-level user to run schedules. The Schedule section is where the administrator can review and modify the timing of scheduled Argos reports. You can view the properties of a schedule by double-clicking on it. You can modify the user that created the schedule or the user to run the schedule. You can also set the next runtime and final runtime. You can also specify what day of the week to run and the frequency. At the bottom is where you can override the timeout. FTP is part of Argos in the scheduling function. To add a new FTP host, click on the Add Host button. This will give us the FTP properties window where the administrator can enter the FTP information. The data dictionary is a feature that stores information about your data, including table, field aliases, and joins. The dictionary is stored in Maps but is used in Argos in the Visual Designer. Using the data dictionary, you will no longer need to specify an alias in your queries. The data dictionary is stored in Maps, but it can be used and edited within Argos. To import a dictionary, click on the Lego with the plus sign. Browse to the dictionary file, And you can download the Banner General Dictionary in the Co-op community page in the Share section. Once you select the file, you'll be able to create a new dictionary or append to an existing one. I'm just going to create a new dictionary, and my dictionary will import. Once the dictionary is imported, I need to associate it with an ADO connection. Anytime you connect to Argos with this ADO connection, it's going to use this dictionary. Now I can see the aliases, the field joins, and the table joins. This particular dictionary doesn't have any field or table joins. But on the Aliases tab, you can see the object name, the aliases, and description of the object. The last column, the status column, indicates the status of the dictionary definition. There are two statuses: contribution and suggestion. A contribution is a data definition that has been accepted and can be used. A suggestion is a definition that has not been accepted and is not available for use. For a suggestion to be accepted, an administrator needs to select the suggestion and use the thumbs up button or thumbs down button to reject it. The thumbs down arrow will change a status to a suggestion. As you see, that just changed it to a suggestion. I'll go ahead and change this back to a contribution. And you can also use the red X button to delete a definition. If you right-click on an alias, you can edit it. And on the Members tab, you can have any users making suggestions, but not all users can be contributors or administrators of the dictionary. Click on the person icon to add in a person and choose who you want to add. The user will default as a contributor, and I can use the button at the top to make them an administrator as well. API stands for Application Programming Interface. The API module allows users to call Argos reports from outside of Argos via HTML, web portals, and other third-party applications. The report itself can be called in three different ways: automatic, which uses an HTML get and post method; interactive, which brings up the Argos client and loads the dashboard; or via MapRappy, which is an executable. The API HTTP refer screen allows for an Argos report to be invoked via the API. This screen is used to grant the ability to call reports via the API to specific computers. This prevents arbitrary computers from executing reports even if they have the URL and the report unique identifier. To add a new approved HTTP refer, click on the green Add Refer icon at the top. Name the server, then add any URLs or IP addresses the server might be using by clicking on the Add URL button on the right-hand side. You may also choose to have a default username and password for API reports from that server, which you enter here. Usernames and passwords passed in via get, post, form, MapRappy, or from a report definition will override the username and password entered here. We've actually come to the end of the training today, so thank you for attending, and I hope everyone has a great day.